agenda for today goes as follows. Eric Preston will be reviewing some of the cookie-related issues that you're likely to encounter in your use of LTI and various platforms and tools, and some best practices for addressing some of the problems inherent with cookies and changing browser web infrastructure around the use of cookies. So there will be some period of time. I'll let Eric describe if he wants to take questions during his presentation throughout or save them for the end. And then we also have we're reserving some time to recover some questions that the IMS has received between Roundtable meetings through the Google form. You can see a link to that also here in the agenda document. So we'll be reviewing some of those question and answers. And then if anyone has new questions or topics that are unclear to you that would be helpful to get the expertise of the LTI developer community while you have them here in a phone call or Zoom meeting, that's part of our goal today too. So, so Eric, are you ready to begin?
Yes, I am, once I could find my mouse. And
all right, you scared me there for a minute. I was thinking I was just talking to myself the last few minutes.
No. You're all good. You're all good. All right. So my name's Eric Preston. I'm a software engineer with Blackboard, work on the Blackboard Learn LTI implementation, been on the technical working group here for 3 or 4 years. I am not a browser / cookie / security expert. I don't play one on TV, and I have not stayed at a Holiday Inn Express recently. However, I'm going to give this presentation, do the best that I can. It's a short 11-slide presentation. One of them is a title and one of them's a, do you have any questions? Feel free to ask questions during this. I'm not looking at the chat, however. So what are we going to do? We're going to talk about why do we need cookies, why they are blocked. We're going to look at some workarounds. We're going to look at some code. And we'll talk about the future of cookies. So why are cookies blocked and why do we need them? I guess we should start with the second question first. Why do we need cookies? Well, a couple of reasons. They taste good. The other reason is that web applications since the late 90s have been using cookies to maintain a session for a user. So you log into your bank, the bank sets a session cookie, and every time you click on a link in your bank's web application, it knows who you are. And that's worked reasonably well for 20 years plus. But there's a downside with cookies. And what's the downside? The downside is they can be used for tracking where you've been on websites. And so if you go to Amazon.com, it could set a cookie. And then you go to another site in another tab, and all of a sudden that cookie gets passed, gets passed back from that other site. That cookie then knows where you've been, so that when you go to Amazon the next time, it knows where you've been, and it can like start serving up ads for you, or Google can, or Facebook can. Sorry, the issue is this. Well, you don't need me to explain how cookies work, but any rate, if you have a website that then hosts an iframe inside that website, and that iframe gets the cookies that were set by the website, then whatever in that iframe can know where you've been, because it gets those cookies that were set in the main page on the browser. And so Safari has turned that off by default for a long time now. And the latest version of Safari, I believe, does allow you to say, do you want to turn tracking on? So it sounds pretty bleak. It says, wow, do you really want to be tracked by all the people on the internet? You probably want to say no. In Chrome, they've tried disabling cookies, third-party cookies. Again, so the third-party, I'm not doing this very well. Let's talk about first and third-party cookies. If the page, if the website is this yellow thing on the right, and the green and the purple box are iframes within that page, that website, then the cookies from the box inside, from the box inside are considered third party. So first party cookies are from the yellow box, which is your application that you went to. The third party cookies are from these iframes. They're, some other website serving up an advertisement or serving up something, because that's how ads get served in the internet world. And who's the second party? Well, the second party is you, right? It's the user agent over here on the left. You're the second party between the first and the third parties. If we go back to this one, so browsers are disabling third-party cookies so that you can't be, your activity can't be tracked on the internet. Safari has disabled this by default for a long time. Chrome's been trying to slowly disable this, but the irony is that Chrome's built by Google, and Google wants to be able to track what you're doing. So a lot of their applications break when this happens. The other thing that's going on is that, let's go back to the banking example, and you are logged into your bank, so you have a session cookie, and then all of a sudden somebody sends you an email and says, hey, click here and check out this really cool thing that I've got. So you click on this link in your email and you go to that site, but you're still logged into your bank, but you've got a session cookie. And if that site gets your session cookie, then they can go to your bank logged in as you. So that's a cross-site request forgery attack. Well, any good banking application or any good internet application is going to have mechanisms to prevent that from happening. However, there are websites, even though it's 2020, a year that will live in infamy, many websites still don't know how to prevent cross-site request forgery attacks. They don't serve their pages up with a unique nonce that has to get sent back. And if they just rely on a session cookie, then they've opened you up to a cross-site request forgery attack. So browsers, and Chrome recently has turned that off, that a cookie, when you post to a third party, it won't send the cookies along, even though they originated from the place that you started from, because again, it's to prevent this. Right, so we've covered the cases of why browsers are turning off cookies. But look at the LTI case. In the LTI case, we have a trust relationship between a platform like an LMS vendor and a tool. Let's say it's Cengage or Turnitin or VitalSource or Kaltura or any other tool that you use. And the common UI mechanism for supporting that integration is to display that tool in an iframe. because we don't want to open up a new window for a tool or a new tab. Then it's not a nice seamless experience. And here, for example, I've created a discussion forum and I want to embed an LTI tool that is relevant for this discussion. I don't want to have them open it in a new tab to look at that content. Maybe it's a video, maybe it's a video. So, but the problem is that your application or this third-party app, the thing in red, won't work if it doesn't have access to cookies, because again, it needs to set a session because it wants to know who the user is who's using the tool, right? If it's a turn it in assignment, you kind of got to know who the user is. So what do we do? Well, we're kind of screwed, basically. One thing, so the problem is that the browsers are preventing the cookies from being sent to this third party, right? So the first party, the LMS, is going to launch in an iframe this LTI tool. The LTI tool then sets a cookie and says the next time you click on my LTI tool, let's say you're going to, submit the test, I need to know who you are. I want that session cookie back, but the browser isn't going to send that session cookie back, so it doesn't know who you are, so the tool doesn't work. So what can you do? You can detect, unfortunately, there's really nothing the platform can do at this point, right? Because the platform doesn't control sending cookies. It's the browser that's doing that. And I guess that's really technically the second party is the browser in the middle here, right? And so the user agent. So what can we do? Well, a tool theoretically could test to see if cookies are enabled, and if they aren't, then it could open itself up into a new window, basically break out of the iframe and open in a new window. That's a lot of ugly JavaScript code that a Roundtable went over a couple of months ago, and so you can look that up to see that again. But basically the code looks like this. You set a cookie on the server side, whatever your server side language is, and then you write some JavaScript that says, can I access cookies? So at the browser time, it runs this JavaScript and says, can I access cookies? And how does it know if it can access cookies? It looks to see if this navigator.cookie enabled flag is set, but a lot of browsers don't support that. And so then it says, hey, did that cookie that I set, can I get at it now in the browser? And if the answer is no, then I need to reopen in a new window. Or if it's yes, then I can redirect to the URL that we tried to go to initially. That's pretty ugly code. If you really need to set a cookie, this is going to be a way to solve that problem. The other solution to the problem is just always have your tool open in a new window. But again, we've talked about why that's not a good thing. And then the last solution, unfortunately, is don't use cookies. So you could write a single page application, which a lot of people are doing for new applications, where you store the user session information in JavaScript that you served up from the server when you first loaded the app. And then if you're building a single page React, for instance, application, doesn't have to be React, it could be Angular, whatever your favorite JavaScript framework for building a single page application is, you can store the session that way and not have to store it in a cookie. The deep linking case, which is a bug that we just discovered in Blackboard a couple weeks ago, is a new change in Chrome that we have a fix for. The fix is out now, but what happened was you launch from the platform to the tool in an iframe. It didn't matter actually if it was in an iframe or not. You launch to the tool, which is a third party. You set a cookie, which is the user session, and you want that cookie back when the tool selects content that gets sent back to the LMS, so that we know which user was doing that operation. So the tool posts back to the LMS with the content, with the deep linking response, and the platform expects the cookie back, but the cookie doesn't come back because, again, Chrome changed to not send third-party cookies across on a forum post for the cross-site request forgery issue. And so we solved that problem in a different way without relying on cookies. So that's another case where cookie handling in browsers changed and broke the internet. There are a couple of resources here. So there's this same site cookies explained. So sorry, one thing I should have backed up and said, if your cookie, if you really need to use a cookie and you trust the receiver of that cookie, then you could set some flags on the cookie, which are called same site equals none, which says it doesn't have to come from the same site. And you have to set it to be secure, and that so that the cookie can't be viewed, it can't be somebody who's sniffing the internet connection. So it can only be sent if it's going over an HTTPS connection. The problem with that, and so a lot of tool vendors made that change this spring because Chrome changed their default behavior. But the problem with that is that's only a temporary solution because browsers are just gonna not even allow that as a choice, or at least not as a default choice. And so asking 1,000 or 10,000 or 100,000 students to change their browser settings isn't really a viable option. So there's some resources here you can look at to at least understand how same site cookies work, some recipes for getting around it, but really the future is bleak when it comes to cookies and browsers, because what they really need to do is they need to come up with a way, a different mechanism where we can say this is a trusted site and don't block cookies because we're not worried about tracking cookies here, and we're not worried about cross-site request forgery attacks. I don't know how browsers are going to do this. If they are going to do it, maybe they just don't care. So at any rate, that's all I got. I realize that was a little haphazard, but it's the best I could do in the time I had, and I can take questions, or other people can take questions.
Thanks, Eric. Yeah, does anyone have any questions? There weren't any that came through on the chat that I saw. Feel free to type something in, or if you want to turn on your microphone, that's okay too, and just speak your question out loud. All right. Not hearing any cookie related questions.
Good.
So, all right. Thanks for a well-covered presentation then, Eric. So Bracken, for the Q&A section, oh, here's something that just came in on the chat. Sounds like the recommendation is to avoid cookies and move to a single page app. Would the LTI folks agree with that?
I mean, single page app, or I mean, it's basically the browser retains the states. Some kind of JavaScript doesn't really have to be a single page app, but that means in that case, you would have to carry it more like in the URL or in the request. You have to carry it around if you're moving from one page to another. But yes, you should not rely on cookies to borrow your state, to store your state.
Oh, and I forgot to share something. I agree wholeheartedly with what Claude said, except that with LTI 1.3, we adopted the OpenID Connect flow for security reasons. And the security reason there is to prevent cross-site request forgery attacks when you're doing an LTI launch. And the OIDC spec, let me share my screen here. So the OIDC spec says very clearly that in order to provide security for OpenID Connect flows to prevent cross-site request forgery attacks, you should set a state field on your end, pass that back to, so the OIDC Connect flow is the platform makes a login request to the tool redirects back to the platform with a state value, the platform then posts the LTI launch back to the tool, passing that state value that it got. The tool then looks at that state value that it gets in the post and compares it with the value that it generated. Well, how does it find the value that it generated for that particular launch? It stores it in a cookie. And in fact, that's what the OIDC spec says you should do. Right here in the spec. So we're trying to solve one security problem by using cookies, and then we're trying to avoid not necessarily a security problem, but a privacy problem by disabling cookies. Uh-oh, we have a conflict of interest here. So I don't have a good answer for this, but right now with OIDC and the LTI 1.3 flow, I don't know a good way around this, except I suppose, you know, single page app, and you set the state somehow that way, and store it in JavaScript.
Yeah, and then you're a bit vulnerable, but still you're a bit vulnerable. I think it's going to be, it comes to trade-off, and I think here, I mean, you have always the ability to break out for it if you know, to a new window, and usually I think it's like, I'm not an expert in this area, but usually OpenID is better to, the pure OpenID flow is always better to be primary in the user agent anyway, and I think they would even not advise it to be done in a mobile app. It would always ask you to, that the ideal flow would be to break out to the browser. The issue here, obviously, is that we do an OpenID flow on every LTI launch. So after that, then you can go to, I guess, to a lesser level of state, right? State is really to make sure it's coming up from the same browser. So the cookie marker is a very easy answers, but it just doesn't work always. Then you can find, I guess, alternate ways. I think another way that's been seen is to do some kind of browser fingerprinting so it's not as safe, but at least you get a sense that it's coming up from the same user agent. And then, but then I know there are work being done in that area around fingerprinting, but that's also an alternative. It's where it really depends where you put your dial on how secure you want to be. In that sense. So I think, yeah, fingerprinting is coming up like a maybe sometimes good enough way to say, okay, I'm storing in that state which kind of browser is coming from, and when the response comes back, it's better come from the same one, and it gets pretty close. So, but yes, I know there is this work. It's like it's always a parade, right? Things like so. Yeah. So I'm curious to see what it would mean to prevent fingerprinting. I've always been thinking, what does it mean? What do you change the user agent signature on every request? What exactly would it mean? And you know, because the thing is that again, fingerprinting could be a wide net or very close net. It's like if you. So yeah. So I think this is. I don't know. We don't have good answers. There is just workarounds. There is no. I'm not aware of any straight replacement.
Yeah, I mean, really, what's happening is we're at the mercy of what browser vendors are doing, and they're not working with us, obviously, to help solve this problem. So we are using industry standard practices to mitigate security issues, and now those industry standard practices are really no longer viable for how we're doing things. And so, yeah, we're going to have to come up with something. We don't have, as Claude said, we don't really have.
Yeah, and I think it really depends of your, you know, of what's behind the LTI link, because you know, is it ubiquitous or is it a payment gateway? It's like you have a word gradient of what does it mean to execute that LTI launch, and so it might mean that on your as a tool you might take an action or another around the specific vulnerability here of being able to replay an LTI launch in a short time frame in another browser somewhere else, you know. So you know, that's you'll have to go on that. I mean, you might also decide a bit of an hybrid approach, like to set up identity, you break out, but once identity is set up, you subsequent launches, but then you don't have cookies, so you don't even know what are the subsequent launches. You don't retain state. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, but I'd be curious to understand. Yes, the as Chuck is pointing out, I mean, I've been curious about what is the anti-fingerprinting effort. What does it really mean? Because if it's anti-fingerprinting between browser sessions, and we don't care, is it two requests done in the same browser session? Would they would they just be completely different? I mean, this is. Yeah, so what would really mean? So I think that's something we need to follow up, because right now I think fingerprinting has been kind of a fair variation to make sure that this is not replayed in another context.
Great. Mark, should we transition to the rest of the Q&A?
Yeah, do you feel like we need the bulk of that time for the Q&A? I'm just wondering if we covered everything that came through on the chat as far as cookie questions. Did anyone feel like?
I think so. There's some ongoing discussion about the future of it, and we'll see what comes up.
Okay.
And this is actually going to come up again in the QA, but as a transitional comment, this is an ever-moving field. We had our big in February with the Chrome same site stuff was a big deal, and all these. This is ever evolving, and we haven't solved all the problems. We never will, because new ones will keep coming up. And I think what we as an LTI community here together now, what we're trying to do is get better at learning and communicating these with each other. Sometimes in the past, the more involved people with LTI knew how to solve some of these problems, and but that wasn't written down or expressed well to the rest of the community. And so there was different degrees of understanding around all this. So I think our main defense against this is just, everyone who's solving these problems keep talking with each other. That's why we're doing these meetings, is to help spread the knowledge of these, and both for what people are currently doing, what they're seeing in the future, and as new problems pop up. So yeah, we're just trying to work through this together. I think that's really the only way that this will work out. So let me share. So we have a form for accepting questions for the roundtable. There's also forums and other ways to get answers more quickly, but so I'm just going to go through these. I'll read the question, and people from the work group here will answer as they can. So first one, is LTI Advantage names and roles designed to allow for both SIS section memberships to be included in responses about course member names and roles? Also, can tools request names and roles information at times other than during a tool launch?
So I would just go on first on the second one. Yes, it can be used to be called. So you can retain the names and roles endpoint and basically call it at later on, or it doesn't have to be synchronous with the actual launch. I mean, it's often a good practice. Like in LTI, those URLs are passed to you on every launch, and so there is still this idea that they might change, but they actually pretty much are fairly stable. So that's something you could use. But I would probably just make sure that every time you have an LTI launch, you just make sure to make sure that the API, that for some reason the endpoint would have changed. So we just check that. As for the other question, I'm not. So right now it's just give you the current context enrollment. So that's basically what it has. And if there are additional data around, like the SIS data might come around as additional attributes of the users, but outside of that, I don't know that it would give you any additional section information. I'm not sure exactly what is being looked at here.
Claude, if I haven't actually seen what the implementations of all this do, but if on an LTI launch, you have a custom variable substitution to get all the SIS IDs, and you get those in the LTI launch in the user stuff, would you or would you not expect that same information to come across in the names and roles calls versus the LTI launches themselves?
You would expect them, but I don't think it's a strong requirement. There is the idea that to resolve some of the custom parameters that are user specific to be resolved and passed around. But I think the mileage may vary.
Yeah, the core idea there, I mean, the names and roles specifies all the data that comes, but one of the core hopes there is that you can get the same information that you would get from an LTI launch for each of the users. But some of those other properties and variable substitutions, you know, they're not hard requirements, and so it might be slightly different between LMS. And I'm not quite sure what the situation looks like around this. So.
Yeah. Yeah, and another thing also, since I've been hearing of an asynchronous request to names and roles, there is also a feature of names and roles which is not always supported by all LMS, but can be useful if the intent is to do some kind of keep in sync cron or something like that. Is that there is a specification may expose a difference API, a different endpoint. So in which case, you know that if you retain that URL, when you call on it, you're just going to get the changes that happened since the last time you called. So rather than having to do a full sync and get the full roster every time, you can just get the changes from your previous call. So every call, if the platform supports it, every response will contain the endpoint to ask for the difference since that response was generated. So that's something to be, that if it's around, it's good to leverage if your intent is again to do some kind of sync mechanics.
All right, next question. For a tool, what is a unique identifier for an institution? Assuming in the claims of an LTI launch.
Well, I think there is multiple answers to that. So I can just give us how we see it. We see mostly the institution for us is tied to the LTI relationship. So for us, we tie the institution to the tuple client ID, deployment ID. And so that's basically defines this LTI relationship. And we usually tie that to an institution. So that's the way we do it purely from a more of an accounting perspective, like is this institution is going to be identified, it's going to be identified when it's coming up with the LTI request. It's going to say the client ID is going to, and the issuer are going to identify the LMS vendors and stuff, and the deployment ID is really going to identify this account, which is an institution. Outside of that, there is in the claim for the platform, there is a tool consumer GUID, which has, also could be used as the identifier of an institution instance. I would probably even say an LMS instance. So that's the tool consumer GUID. That would be the other one that comes to mind.
Yeah. So for 1.3's registration model, the deployment ID is the primary identifier of an institution, or really of a customer, the person who's paying, things like that. So deployment ID.
Yeah,
All
but
right.
TC GUID could be useful because it identifies the LMS, especially because, yeah, so it's good as a secondary one also to be aware of.
Okay. What is the time scope of deep linking? Do platforms require that process to be performed again for every course section, every semester quarter? Question is how to look up the institution platform settings. So I think, I don't quite understand this, but one part of what deep linking is you want to add a new LTI link into an LMS, for example, and you do an LTI launch, the tool shows an interface, they select the resource or resources, and those LTI links get returned to the LMS. And once they're in the LMS, they're in the modules or lessons area the same as if you had manually created an LTI link or imported them with a common cartridge. So they're just links in that course, and the time scope is there's the length of that course. And if you course copy, those links would be copied. You would expect them to be copied to a new course within the LMS. So there's not too much around time scope of what's returned from deep linking. With what Eric talked about with, there's browsers are stopping posts, cross-domain posts. There's been new cookie problems there. And so there is some technical time scope in executing a deep link now. We're starting to have problems around that, but I think, I don't think there's questions around that, but there are, some potential problems around the timing of returning from a deep linking now in the browsers. But those are my two thoughts. I don't, Claude, does anyone else have potential answers to this? I didn't quite understand the question, but maybe the rambling will help.
Sounds good to me.
I understood the question the way you did, which is, once you've created those links via deep linking, those links should be good forever.
Yeah, and I would also add that it's expected that the return from the deep link is in the same session on the LMS, meaning that that's not a web service call. That's if you somehow have started a deep link, then you log out of the LMS, and then somehow the deep link response comes back. That's all bets are off at that point.
Yep. And we got
Correct.
in chat that we're good to go. So next, has IMS considered creating an assignment claim so that the tool knows the assignment ID from the platform? For instance, needs the assignment info and uses the resource claim for the assignment data. It'd be better and easier if there's a separate claim for assignment. So I know some of the LMSs have custom substitution variables where you can get that LMS's ID for that assignment and do things with that with their native API. You know, it could be that we could all agree to a specific substitution variable for that. I don't think that exists already. And that's, you know, that's if you're planning to do custom things to LMS for that. If you're using assignments and grades, you know, there is an identifier that goes along with those if they're assignments that you or grade columns you created yourself as a tool, and those do come across when an LTI a resource is tied to that grade column. So that's if you're staying within the LTI world, you know, this kind of already happens. If you're doing native LMS stuff, it depends on what the LMS implements for now. But it might be a good idea to make a consistent substitution variable for that across the LMSs. Anyone else have thoughts on that?
There's likely to be a proposal that will be put before the working group real soon that touches on this area.
Perfect. All right, I'm going on to the next one. Can you send standards for which a score is graded against also in grade passback? So I'll just do that first one. So I'm assuming this means like curriculum standards, a case GUID, or, you know, ASN GUID, something like that. Right now, it's on the LTI workgroup's backlog to better integrate curriculum standards and case specifically into LTI in general, grading specifically. So no, I do not believe there's a way to do this unless you're using the extensions area. But there is, you know, the most common use case for how LTI links work in the LMS mitigates some of the problem around this. You know, say you have a common cartridge that has, you know, 10 LTI links in it and they're all tagged with case GUIDs. You import those into the LMS, and the LMS knows that alignment in the LMS's gradebook. And generally in an LMS-centric LTI world, the LMS owns the gradebook, and each of those columns knows the standard that they're aligned to. And so if you have an LTI launch that sends a score back for that grade column, the LMS knows already, or it can know, the curriculum standard it's aligned to, and that allows it to do all the reporting that the LMS is capable of. So in a common situation where the LMS owns the gradebook and the LMS can know the alignment already, you know, the grade return not being able to specify the standard doesn't break a lot of those workflows. But there are a lot where this would be needed, and it's definitely an item that the group needs to address in the future that we haven't gotten to. Anyone else have an answer for this first part before I ask the next parts?
Yeah, just there has been some work on the one roster extension that I think that we were thinking that we could apply also to the line to the score passback, which is really a breakdown around the case standards and a score per case standard. So there's been some work on the IMS side, and the idea was more or less to reuse that as a proposal, probably a best practice to begin with or something along those lines.
Yep. And there's definitely a lot of areas we need to work a case into other standards better than it is now. That's in progress, but all right. Are JWKS compatible tools identified anywhere on the IMS website? No. So initially, when we first released 1.3, we did not require having a JWKS URL endpoint for many reasons. We've since somewhat regretted that and believe that should be the standard best practice, but we don't differentiate that in any way on the product directory or anything like that. As a possibility, the certification suite does allow you to choose which way you're going to do it. And, maybe this is something that, could be useful to help people understand what tools have available right now. But as of right now, no, it's not anywhere on the site that I know of. All right, gonna go to the next question, unless we got something. Okay. All right, so these last two are about Safari and cookies. So again, part of the pre-answer to these, are kind of what I said at the beginning of this Q&A session, was this is ever evolving, and we as a community will have to keep talking and figuring these out together. So when we don't have great answers for all these, we're all trying to figure it out. So Safari web browser recently released an update that enforces intelligent tracking prevention, which prevents third-party cookies. This is causing problems with my content provider service, which requires SSO and cookie access as it uses LTI to display the contents. Does IMS Global have any recommendations for setting cookies and displaying third-party content within an LMS over LTI, for example? So that's kind of what we talked about a lot today already. We have some guidances. There's some tricks with this, and it's hard problems. Right at the end of what Claude and Eric were talking about were some of the ways to mitigate not having a cookie there, or popping into new windows stuff. So there's that kind of guidance, and that is a bit in some of our documents. I think we do need to improve, make all those guidances a lot easier to find and understand, but it's out there, but it's not super clear everywhere. For example, some users advocate that the LMS should execute an OAuth 2.0 redirect in order to set a cookie for the content provider site before it initiates basic LTI content request. Now, how we, that's been an option. There's been a lot of discussion about what the next steps will be, because we're kind of losing the iframe cookie battle. And so there's a lot of possibilities where we could go on that, and we don't have anything specific, and we keep, things like this keep coming up. And so I think that's a viable option. We haven't, as a work group, focused deeply on this problem yet. It keeps coming up, and since we kind of have all these workarounds, we haven't gone to the next phase. But we have lots of discussions like, how is LTI going to survive long term in these environments? And questions like this OAuth 2 redirect are part of that. So that's not really a great answer, but does anyone else have any comments around this thing again? And the next question is, Safari is blocking third-party cookies. How do we deal with that? And again, that's what we talked about at the beginning, and Claude's comments around the user agent and stuff like that were all around trying to address this. And it's a hard problem that we hope we'll keep sharing with each other the solutions to. So that's all of the submitted questions that we had. Those go back a couple months now. So we finally got through them. So if there's, we still have a few more minutes. If there's anyone who wants to speak up and ask another question, you can unmute or put it in the chat. We're happy to give it a go.
I submitted a question online on the Google form, but I can re-ask it here.
Go ahead.
The tool that I'm working with, that I work for, ties an LTI link to a specific course in our site. And so we connect the context of an LMS to our course. And so when a course is copied in an LMS, it has the LTI links that point to the wrong course. So I'm just wondering what options are available, what suggestions do you have to handle the situation when an LTI link is copied and the new LTI context does not have permissions in the tool to access that resource?
So you have a URL, an LTI URL that points to a specific resource within your learning tool, your LTI tool, and the LMS. So this isn't about LMS permissions, it's about permissions in your tool that the LTI links are pointing to. Is that right?
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a good question. Maybe one of the other tool providers will have a better answer, but I'll give you another ramble on this. So you import via deep link or something, LTI link into course 1, and you know that this course has access because how do you know they have access in the first place? Did a teacher sign in and grant that? Did someone?
Yeah, during the deep link process, the teacher selects which course on our site they want to connect to their context.
Mm-hmm.
And then that is used to display a list of assignments that they have in our site that they can connect to that context.
Yeah, some of the patterns, I mean, there's a bunch of different ways that people have dealt with this. So course copy is always a tricky problem, but you know, a common pattern is if you see an LTI launch for a resource that you recognize, but you haven't seen this course in the LMS or this user or something, you can, you know, re-authenticate them in the way that you were doing in deep linking, or ask them like, hey, is this the same course as that? If they're a teacher role, you know, just kind of pay attention to the role and things like that. So a lot of times it's just, you know, my best practice, we haven't exactly described the best practice for the course copy flow, but the general idea is that, you know, if a teacher copies it or an instruction designer copies it, they should go click, you know, the settings LTI link for any given vendor, or, you know, make sure they all work and tie them together. So the hope is that a teacher or course designer will be the first ones to click in to your tool after the course is copied, and then you're able to provide mechanisms for them to, so that you can know that this is, you know, a copy of that other course, and so it should have, you know, similar properties and things like that. So that's one pattern that's been successful in some cases, but there's a lot of people who have implemented some other things. Does anyone else have
Yeah, I would just add to that you kind of corner yourself if you put a link that is bidden to the current context. What I mean was that LTI give you as additional data as a context, a user, and everything like that. So those should be coming up from the LTI payload and should not be engraved, enshrined into the link itself, because the link can be copied and then therefore it would not be usable. So ideally, the link is itself disconnected from the actual course, and this since the course comes around anyway, the context ID always comes around anyway on every request, and somehow the binding could be done you know, outside of being directly put into the URL. If the URL is bound to the current context and can be used in another context, there is nothing in the LTI specification that says this link is not copyable. There's nothing like that. So it would be copied, and then it would be on your tool site to say this link is not appropriate for this course or something like that. But ideally, it's something that you can reauthorize access or understand it's a copy or anything like that. But yeah, it should not be tied to a near given context, because they can be copied, and there is nothing to say this is a for this context only kind of link. So
some of the, again, some of the potential best practices we've discussed is a specific launch that an LMS could implement after a course copy, where they, like, so say an LMS does a course copy, they recognize there's LTI links in there, and maybe an LTI vendor registered a specific course copy settings launch message type, and the LMS could present that to them and say, hey, this vendor wants you to click this link every time you copy your course to make sure your settings are correct. You know, that's workflow we've discussed. It's never actually quite made it all the way through. And so people do workarounds by having, you know, the first time a teacher enters one of the normal links in the course, they try to, you know, guess that that's the situation. So yeah, this is an area that definitely needs improvement, and we talk about it, but for now, you just kind of got to work through it in the ways we discussed.
Okay, yeah, I think I have what I need to keep going and some ideas. So thank you very much.
Yep. Anyone else want to do one last question? All right, Mark, I think we're good.
Sorry, I was frantically trying to re-enable video and things. I'm new to this group, so this might be the wrong forum, and the question might be completely inappropriate. But the security update for LTI 1 is coming into force in December. But from my research, I've sort of noticed that Desire to Learn and Brightspace seem to support it, and Canvas state that they don't. But I wasn't sure if there was a general sense that this is something that everybody needs to be trying to work towards.
Do you mean the LTI like 1.1.1 thing?
Correct.
1.1? Yeah. So yeah, we can answer that pretty easily. security problem that we had, the OpenID Connect login flow solves for LTI 1.3. That security update for LTI 1.1 series is solving that same security problem by adding a 2-leg LTI launch. Most vendors have decided to just suggest that people upgrade to 1.3 to get around that particular security problem, because it wasn't seen as too big of, the potential of that is pretty low. So, you know, D12 is pretty much the only one who implemented that, and everyone else has said, hey, just upgrade to 1.3 because that's better anyway, and we want everyone, you know, we want everyone to do that and not stay on 1.1 because it's, you know, it's basically deprecated now. So it was just kind of, that's the choice most of those platforms made, and that's, so the state is, for a tool, you can probably ignore it, and you should just start concentrating on 1.3.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.
Yep. All right, Mark, Mikhail, I think we're good to wrap it up.
Okay, thank you, everyone. I did want to mention, in case you've heard it discussed here in the roundtable meeting, or maybe just around the LTI work group in general, we've been working on a dynamic registration or kind of auto registration flow for LTI 1.3. And there's been some early adopters, and we've been reviewing it internally and making some improvements to the documentation based on that review and the early implementation work. So there's a possibility that we would have for our October roundtable, maybe November, where we would discuss that or demonstrate some of that to this group if there is interest in seeing what future tool registrations might look like in a more automated or dynamic fashion. So just wanted to alert you to that work. Internally, the group is looking at around mid-October to finalize a member release of that specification. So just to whet the appetite a little bit, if that is of interest, we will look to focus one of these one or next upcoming roundtable meetings around that topic. So thanks again, Bracken and Eric, for your work going through the demo and the discussion around cookies and the various questions that have been submitted, and for your attendance and participation today. Thanks, everyone. We'll meet again on the 27th of October for our next roundtable. Bye for now.